Good morning, everyone. This is Deborah Dudak from the Fountaindale Public Library in Bolingbrook, Illinois. Super excited to have you guys on board with us today. I'm going to let all our friends who are coming in, settle down, grab their handout, get a second cup of coffee, and we're going to give our friends a couple more minutes to get everything around before we start our webinar today. We had a lot of really amazing people sign up for our webinar today. Super excited to see everybody here. We're going through the attendee list. Give a special shout out to Barbara. Hi, Barbara, it's lovely to see you. Miss Kathy, we're happy to have you with us. Super pleased to see you. There's a couple of my favorite Debs are here. Dave is back for some more genealogy club instruction. Jay and Jennifer Warner, it's good to see you guys. Joseph, Judy, oh, the Judy squad's here. Karen, Kathy, Larry, Laura, Leslie. There's Mike, hi Mike. Miss Nancy. There's Roseanne, it's good to see you, Roseanne. Oh, hi from Ontario. I'm loving the Ontario Genealogical Society webinars right now. They're super, super great. Signed up for a couple myself. There's Tim. Oh, hi, Linda from Charlotte. Super happy that you can make it with us. There's Tim, our friend Tim, down from near Springfield.
Hi, Tim.
Hi, Tim. You know, he's engaged to a wonderful young lady, and they're going to get married in a couple of months. So congrats, Tim. Super happy that you're here. All right, friends. So we do have a couple more people that we're going to wait for before we get started today. Couple housekeeping things. Please feel free to use the the question and answer tab, either at the bottom or at the top of your webinar area. You're going to want to bring up those questions during the program, please. It doesn't annoy us for you to send those, so send those in if you need clarification. And if you need clarification, I'll bring that up to Tina during the lecture today. Please reserve the chat once we get started. Please reserve the chat for any tech issues. I know you guys don't know this, but every time we see a chat come up, it pops up on the screen and it kind of blocks out some of the text on the screen for some of the other attendees and for the people watching the recorded webinar later. So after you guys have said hello and checking in for the chat, please use the Q&A area once we get started, unless you have a tech issue. So we are rocking and rolling with 40 attendees. And this morning, ladies and gentlemen, I'm super stoked because we have our friend Tina Beaird with us. Super excited to have her. As usual, Tina, this is great. Thanks so much for stopping in and hanging out with us today.
Deb, you know I love you.
Hello,
everybody. Good morning. I'm glad to see so many familiar names on here. Doesn't Deb sound like Romper Room? You know, like she's holding up her little mirror saying, I see Judy and I see Roseanne. Maybe I'm dating myself now with that statement. I guess I am old. So while it's not as lighthearted of a topic as we did last time, it's certainly a topic that's relevant in this day and age. So while I'm definitely going to kind of make comparisons throughout between what happened in 1918 and 1919, by no way is this going to be either a vindication or an admonishment against what is happening currently. But I do want to talk a little bit about the background of the pandemic, what happened. It really comes down to kind of how we're seeing now in 2020, the response, the governmental response, the city response, the state response. Just like we're seeing now, this was a very important part of what was going on in 1918 and 1919 as well. So for some of you who might be familiar with the topic, you might recognize some of the images and some of the statements that I make. But for those of you who haven't really delved into and studied the pandemic like Deb and I have, it's definitely not for the faint of heart. It's horrifying, it's traumatizing, and in many instances, in millions of people around the world, it was life-altering. So what happened? Whoa, what just happened there? I have no idea how we jumped halfway through. Okay, let's go backwards. So how did it all get started? Nobody knows with absolute certainty, and that's one thing that you're going to see whether you're reading John Barry's books or Gina Colada's books or other people who have written on the pandemic, there are a lot of unknowns still, even 100 years later, that they can't say for certain. What they believe to be true is that the earliest outbreak of the flu that began in late February, early March of 1918 seems to have come from a particularly viral strain of swine flu that was happening in Haskell, Kansas. So at the end of February, there are a lot of rumors and stories going around about pigs who are dying in really high numbers in the Haskell, Kansas area. And by the end of February, the humans, the people who are running these pig farms, are starting to get sick. The farmers who are slaughtering the pigs and turning the pigs into food are then taking that food and transporting it around Kansas. One of those destinations is Camp Funston, because just like the rest of us, right, soldiers love bacon. So they're bringing the meat into Kansas City, they're bringing it into other cities, and they're delivering bacon and other pig products to Camp Funston. So humans are starting to get sick around Haskell, Kansas. At the beginning of March, the first week of March, you start having soldiers at Camp Funston who are coming down with the flu. That first week of March, like those first 8 or 9 days between March 4th, when the first case is reported, and March 11th, over 500 soldiers become ill. No fatalities at that point. By the end of March, that number climbs to just over 1,100, and you do start to see 2 or 3 fatalities among soldiers at the camp. So Kansas doesn't look at this as being anything outside of the norm. They see it as being a typical flu year where you'll see a spike in the number of people who are sick, but still a very low mortality rate. And just like now as then, the average mortality during a flu season is about 0.02%. So as soldiers are getting sick, as they're reporting flu cases in and around Kansas, then starts to radiate out into the rest of the Midwest. It starts to move into Colorado. It starts to move into Iowa. It starts to spread as people are shipping things on railroad lines to Chicago and to St. Louis. You start to see it kind of radiating out in circles, but it's still within that typical 0.02% fatality casualty list that you would see in a normal year. So Kansas didn't think to do anything differently. Funston didn't think to do anything differently than they would normally have done. Even though they had a huge number of men sick, like this photo that you see here, they're not quarantining them apart from each other. They're not shielding them. They're not putting sheets up to keep them away from the other soldiers, because they don't see it as being anything outside of how they would normally take care of such a thing. As it begins to spread across the United States in the spring of 1918, once again, it is still within that 0.02% of fatalities that you would normally see. So while you have a huge spike in the number of cases, you're not seeing a huge spike in the number of deaths yet. So it does hit most U.S. service bases. You do see it at Camp Grant. You do see it down in Kelly Field in Texas. You do see it hit the East Coast. But again, it's not anything that's out of the normal range. At the same time that we're dealing with influenza here in the States, you're starting to see a rise in what they consider to be unusually strong cases of bronchopneumonia overseas. So starting in April and in May of 1918, the British doctors are starting to report not only the flu cases like we've been seeing everywhere, but they're starting to report flu viruses coupled with this unusual strain of bronchitis that they had never seen before. And it's affecting up to 10% of the flu cases that they're seeing. They document it, they're keeping an eye on it, but they don't have a way to combat it. They don't have a way to fight it. And as we start to get from spring into late spring and into early summer, you're starting to see those numbers grow, and they're growing exponentially. So what you see going on in Europe is a huge spike in the number of flu cases between April, May, and into June of 1918. But what you're also starting to see is a spike in what comes next. So once people catch the flu, then they're starting to catch things like bronchitis, pneumonia, and other fatal lung disease. What we would consider to be SARS now is what they were catching then. So as this starts to progress throughout May and into June, this particular strain of the flu explodes around the world. So there have been a lot of people who have speculated that it was the US strain of the flu colliding with an Asian strain of the flu that created this new, hyper strain of virus. Research over the last decade has kind of proven that to be incorrect or not 100% true. What they're starting to see now and what they're starting to believe happened is that it was that same virus doing what they would call an antigen shift. And what that means is that a typical virus takes 3 to 4 years to shift into something that becomes contagious again. So once we all become immune to a certain coronavirus, a certain cold, it shifts slowly over time into something new that allows us to be reinfected. What they believe happened was this strain, instead of taking 3 to 4 years to shift and become something different, was shifting in 3 to 4 months. And there's a couple of reasons why they think this happened. They believe the reason why it sped up so quickly in Europe at the front amongst the troops is because you constantly had what's called a fresh host. So overseas in Europe, what's happening is the standard would be you would spend 2 weeks in the rear, you'd spend a week at the front, and then you'd spend 2 to 3 weeks in the rear again. So as those soldiers are getting sick, they're constantly getting a fresh batch of hosts because every week the number of soldiers who haven't caught it, who are now easily exposed to it, are catching it. And then once they've caught it, then they're going back again into the rear and they're continuing to spread it. So it's just growing and growing and growing, and it's shifting because you're constantly being exposed to new fresh hosts. So this deadly strain throughout the summer in Europe at the front is decimating the fighting armies of Europe. The German forces have 30,000 cases, French forces 50,000, British forces 30,000 cases. And those are just the soldiers that are actually, the numbers that are actually being reported. What you're seeing going on in the civilian population, the fatalities are enormous. In Germany, you've got 225,000 deaths, France, 135,000, British, 225,000 deaths among the civilian populations. So why are the numbers amongst the troops so much lower? They truly weren't. There are a couple of reasons why those numbers are underreported, and the same thing is going to be true once US troops start getting exposed. One, you don't want to tell your enemy how many people you have unable to fight because you don't want them to then attack or retaliate. And you also have to be able to keep up with the recording. When you have such an onslaught of people who are getting sick all at once, you don't have the time or the ability to sit and record each and every case. So a lot of them get missed, or a lot of them get misreported, or a lot of them get misdiagnosed. So think of all of the different ways you can say flu, influenza. If you've looked at a death certificate, if you've had a family member who had passed, it could be flu, it could be grip, it could be influenza, it could be bronchopneumonia, it could be lobar pneumonia. There are probably a dozen different terms that they were using to all say the exact same thing. So as the troops in Europe are being decimated, as the civilians are being infected and are dying at a tremendous rate, a lot of people ask me, well, why is it called the Spanish flu? And it's actually, I refuse to call it that because of the reasons behind it. So it's referred to as the Spanish flu, one, because Spain was neutral. Spain and Ireland were neutral during the war, and they had absolutely no reason to lie about the numbers of infections that they had because they didn't have to lowball their numbers because they weren't fighting, they were neutral. So Spain had an unusually high number of people who were ill at this particular time, and they were reporting on it accurately. Another reason why it's referred to as the Spanish flu is because the Allies were trying to guilt Spain into taking a side. So by kind of putting that moniker on it, it was their way of getting even with Spain because Spain wouldn't join the Allied side and wouldn't get involved in the war. So I prefer to refer to it as the influenza pandemic or the flu of 1918. I try very hard not to refer to it as the Spanish influenza because it didn't originate in Spain. It wasn't started in Spain. Spain was not at fault for spreading it. They just happened to be one of the countries who were exposed to it just like the rest of the world. So as Britain, as Spain, as France are all coming down with the flu in April and May of 1918, you see it starting to explode around the world. You see it in Norway, you see it in New Zealand, you see it in Australia, you see it in Argentina. We were actually one of the last for it to boomerang back around to us in the fall of 1918, and I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. So as US troops are starting to head overseas, they're starting to become ill because you would have 3 times as many men on a troop transport ship as you would normally have when you're not actively involved in a military engagement. So you had men in ships who were overcrowded. They were going and depositing their soldiers overseas and then bringing people back with them. So they're bringing it back. It's on board the ships. It's infecting the next batch of soldiers who are getting on board and who are coming over to Europe. So to give an example, not just Camp Funston, but all over the US, you have flu, that early stage of flu in April, May, June of 1918. One of those camps is Camp Dodge. So Camp Dodge boards at Camp Dix in New Jersey, and they're heading overseas to Brest, France. And the units that are on board, the 313th Engineers, for example, arrive in France. And within the week of arriving in France, they're already sick with several soldiers. 6 days after arriving at their destination, the head of their unit dies. Captain Bruce Honeyman of Company A dies of influenza. And he is one of 10 men in the 313th among all companies who wind up perishing within those first 12 days of arriving overseas. So it begins to hit US troops, and it begins to hit them particularly hard into August, September, and October of 1918. So by the time we get into October, and it's the largest push of the war, as they're at the Battle of Saint Michel, and there are, thousands of men who are being injured and wounded, you also have thousands upon thousands of men who are struggling with the flu. So roughly 35% of American soldiers are sick. 1.2 million out of the 4 million soldiers who are fighting in the US forces at this time, both overseas as well as stateside. So when you look at casualty reports, you have 200,000 soldiers who die of injury, but you have 340,000, nearly 100,000 more, who are hospitalized with the flu and its complications. Overseas alone, in that late summer, early fall, 43,000 US soldiers will die overseas. There are lots of records to investigate more if you wanted to do some research on this. At the National Archives 2 in College Park, they have what are called the US casualty files that are 3x5 index cards. And I just pulled some out of the box and took some screenshots of them so you could see them here. They're being listed as, influenza with bronchitis or influenza with lobar pneumonia. And you could see most of these men are all from the same unit, and they all died within a couple of days of each other. So these types of records do exist to keep track of those soldiers who are falling ill and who are perishing overseas. So what happens stateside? How does it get back to the United States? In August of 1918, you get the first inklings in local newspapers that the flu is starting to reach our shores. So there are articles in the New York Times, in the Boston Globe, the Chicago Tribune, that are talking about a passenger liner that is returning from Europe to the United States. In the article, you could see the one out of the Tribune here. They talk about 4 dying of influenza on this passenger liner and scores or dozens more being sick. Nobody thinks anything of it. These passengers get off their ship and they go back to their business. To them, the casualty number is still low. The number of fatalities is still small. But what you start seeing up and down the eastern seaboard is you start seeing a lot of military bases, whether it is from the Boston Navy Yard, whether it's Camp Dix, whether it's Camp Devens, where you're starting to see men coming down not only with this flu like we were talking about in the spring, but this flu that's
Tina, it looks like we lost your audio for a second. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it looks like we've lost audio for just a moment. If everybody can just sit tight with us. T, are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm going to take off my Princess Leia headset. Can you hear me better?
Yes, we can hear you a lot better. Thanks for everybody who popped in for the chat. So yeah, we just lost audio for just a second, but you'll have to rewind, T, and give us the update from after everybody got off the ship.
Okay, so as people got off the ship, the civilians were just sent back into the general population. They didn't quarantine them or keep them from returning to their friends and families. But what was happening with the units that were returning, with the soldiers who were starting to get sick along the eastern seaboard, from Fort Dix to the Boston Navy Yard to down into Baltimore, they were sequestering those soldiers because they were worried about it getting out into the general population. So there are dispatches back and forth in the U.S. Army records talking about how, we've got these men who are sick, we're keeping them quarantined, we're not letting them off the base so that it doesn't get out into the general population. And one thing that John Barry mentions in his book is that, the head epidemiologist, the head doctor for the U.S. Army, had sent a letter to all of the Navy bases saying, we recognize this is going to be a problem, and if it gets out into the general population, it's going to be catastrophic. So they really did try to make the effort to educate the camps and the bases to hold on to your soldiers and not let this get out into the general population. But unfortunately, just like with anything else, that's virtually impossible to do. So in late August, the first place that you start to see it is at the Boston Navy Yard. And they did a very good job of sequestering those soldiers to kind of keep it from getting out into the general population. But they couldn't catch it all. So as soldiers are leaving the Boston Navy Yard and they're being shipped to, whether it's Camp Devens, whether it's the camp just outside of Philadelphia, whether it's Fort Dix, they start to infect these other camps and bases in the last week of August and first week of September. So what makes this new flu strain so unusual is the fact that, like I had said, in an average flu year, the death toll would be 0.02%. So what they're seeing during the pandemic, what they're seeing in summer and fall of 1918, is that number spikes to 2.5%. So you might think, well, that's not that big, 2.5% of the general population. But when your normal fatality rate is 0.02%, it jumped by 25 times the normal fatality rate, which is catastrophic as we see as it starts to spread around the globe. So like I had said, from Norway to New Zealand, this flu is really spreading everywhere, and that fatality list climbs to 25 times the normal fatality rate. So as these soldiers are slowly starting to get out of the Boston Navy Yard, the first place that it arrives is Camp Devens, and I'm going to talk about Camp Devens in just a second. Camp Devens really becomes ground zero for the U.S. exposure to the pandemic in 1918. But as the pandemic spreads, rich or poor, student or doctor, everybody is exposed. It doesn't matter what your socioeconomic background is. It doesn't matter what your educational status is. So you have, both celebrity and student alike becoming ill. Walt Disney becomes sick overseas. Mary Pickford becomes ill. When I talk about Philadelphia, she is one of the people who are involved in this bond drive, this parade that causes hundreds of thousands of people to become sick in Philadelphia. She becomes exposed as well. Bess Wallace, who becomes the future Mrs. Truman, winds up catching the flu as well, and is writing letters back and forth to her fiance at the time, Lieutenant Harry Truman, who is also sick with the flu overseas as well. So their letters in the Truman Library, and I think some of them are digitized, are fascinating, hearing about the personal side of it from Bess, about the friends and family who are becoming sick, and then hearing Harry's side of it, where he's talking about, the soldiers in the units that are becoming sick. But people even like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, comes down with the flu in the fall of 1918 as well. What is also unique about the 1918 pandemic that luckily has never been seen again is the fact that it dropped the life expectancy by 12 years. So in 1917, the average life expectancy was 51. All right, everybody freak out a little by that, because I freaked out a little by that life expectancy in 1917 was only 51 years old. Because of the people that the flu was targeting, that number dropped to 39 years old. The average life expectancy for 1918 now dropped to 39 years old, which is a staggering number when you let that sink in. Why did it drop by 12 years? Well, what typically happens in a flu season? You see that chart kind of on the bottom on the right, you know, underneath on both sides. So when somebody catches the flu, typically the really young and the really old are the ones that are most vulnerable. So you see what they call a U in the number of fatalities. What made this one so unique is its W nature. So you see a huge spike of people between the ages of 20 and 40 who are the most susceptible and who are dying at the highest rates. Why does that happen? Well, they don't know exactly, but the things that they speculate, the reasons that they can use to justify this W spike is because you have people in very close quarters within that age group. You have the soldiers who are at the front, who are fighting, being that new host constantly as the pandemic is spreading. You have people and women in factories and in schools who are in close quarters that are matching that age group. As these men went off to war, you had women who went in to fill those jobs and who are now taking factory jobs where they're working elbow to elbow with their fellow women. But what's interesting about this particular flu strain is the fact that it killed men, sorry guys, it killed men at an unusually higher number than women. So women had a tendency to fare fairly well if they caught it in order to recover from it. It was men who were the ones that were typically seeing either fatalities or long-lasting health effects. So I mentioned that Camp Devens kind of becomes ground zero for this US wave, the second wave of the influenza outbreak. So a lot of people have been talking here in 2020 about there potentially being a second wave, you know, that could come back. That's kind of what happened. The influenza pandemic worked in three waves. You had the spring of 1918, you had the fall of 1918, and then you had the winter spring of 1918-1919, which is known as the third wave or the final wave, that crests and finally dies in May into June of 1919. So in the US, what they consider to be the second wave, which is September to November, really starts at Camp Devens, and by no fault of their own. So as ships are arriving at Boston Navy Yard in Boston Harbor, they're putting them on troop transports and they're sending them to Camp Devens, 35 miles outside of Boston. Those first soldiers start to arrive that last week of August and the first week of September. The first soldier arrives into the base hospital on September 7th, and he's misdiagnosed with spinal meningitis. I want you to keep September 7th in your mind as I start to talk about other military bases as we go ahead. And the reason being is because the soldiers that were coming into Camp Devens would typically stay at Camp Devens anywhere from 4 to 7 days. Then they would get on board troop transports and be sent across the US. Some were going to Seattle, some were going to Chicago, some were going to Georgia, some were going to Kansas City. Within that time period of September 7th and September 14th, Camp Devens shipped out thousands of troops all around the United States, not realizing that they were sending the flu with them. So as these soldiers are leaving and are starting to head out to the other military bases, you start to hear other rumors and cases of other sick men within Camp Devens. You get a little trickle of men who are coming in, and those first several men are all being misdiagnosed as spinal meningitis. And the reason being is because they don't know what it is. They don't recognize it. They haven't seen it. They're hearing reports from Europe, but they haven't seen like a boots on the ground kind of example of what's going on in Europe. So on September 22nd, everything explodes all at once at Camp Devens. In one day, on September 22nd, you had 1,543 men report sick to the hospital. So to give you an idea, Camp Devens and Camp Grant are kind of held up as being the model ideal hospitals in the US Army system. They're large, they're clean, they're equipped to handle up to 1,200 men at a time, 25 doctors on staff. They had a dozen nurses who were there ready to help. Up until this time, I think they had 7 people in the hospital. You had a couple people with measles, you had a couple people with other non-life-threatening injuries. But in one day, you have 1,500 men show up at your door for a hospital that's only equipped to handle 1,200. That doesn't even include what's coming after. The people who are coming in on the 23rd and the 24th and the 25th. The hospital so quickly becomes so overwhelmed. Not only are they out of beds, but they're putting people on the floor, on cots, just laying them on gurneys on the floor, that they have to start commandeering barracks. So they use the motor pool, they start taking other barracks from around Camp Devens to just have a place to put the thousands of men who now need medical treatment. The hospital's so overwhelmed, in 4 days, shuts its doors. Can't even take any more men who are sick. They're told to stay. They're told to stay put. They're told to stay in their barracks if they're too ill to report. So out of the 25 hospital doctors that are on staff, nearly 2/3 of them become ill. A dozen of those nurses become sick. They put out a call desperately to the Red Cross asking for them to send a dozen nurses. They send a dozen nurses. Within 2 days, 8 of those become ill. So only 4 of those nurses are still functioning into the last week of September. The very first reported nursing casualty in the second wave of the pandemic is Miss Margaret Sullivan, who is one of the 2 that passes away at Camp Devens in Massachusetts that last week of September. So now remember, September 7th, you have your first report. You don't start to see that explosion until September 22nd. This is a note that came out September 24th. That's in the National Archives in the file, the hospital file for Camp Devens. And it says, commanding officers will expedite the shipment of bodies in every possible way. So by the 24th, the number of bodies has completely overwhelmed the morgue that they have at Camp Devens. Eventually they run out of wooden caskets. Eventually they even run out of winding sheets to wrap the bodies in. You'll hear reports, I'll talk about it a little later on, about soldiers just being stacked like cordwood, floor to ceiling, because they've run out of individual spaces to secure the bodies because so many are dying at such a rapid rate. So by the start of October, so we're a week and a half in at this point, you have 100 men a day who are perishing. You have 6,000 men who are ill. In 2 weeks, 6,000 men are ill out of a camp of 45,000. By the end of October, you have nearly 20% of the entire camp that has become ill, slightly over 8,800 soldiers. Camp Devens peaks in about 10 weeks, kind of what we've been seeing here in 2020. Camp Devens peaks and the numbers start to decline. Their official death toll, which I'll talk about at the end, I believe is 1,200 soldiers. Officially, I'll come back to the term officially and reality a little later on. So in that first week between September 22nd and September 26th, the Camp Devens brass send for the U.S. Army's best epidemiologists and doctors. They send for Colonel William Welch, they send for Rufus Cole, and they send for Victor Vaughn. Now, Victor Vaughn was an expert dealing with things like malaria cases in the Canal Zone. William Welch had seen things on the front lines during his terms as well. All 3 of them are so horrified and shaken by what they see. William Welch walks out of the first autopsy that he sat in on and immediately made 3 calls. He makes one to Paul Lewis, and he makes 2 more to other well-known epidemiology researchers on the Eastern Seaboard and says, you need to get here right away. We need to figure out what this is and what we're dealing with. So in John Barry's books, William Welch is quoted as saying, as you can read, blood was everywhere, on the linens, on their clothes, pouring out of their nostrils, even coming out of their ears because they're coughing so hard, they're exploding the blood vessels in their eyes. Many of the men, as he says, boys in their teens, early 20s, normally ruddy, red-faced young men were turning blue. He says that color would prove indicative as a deadly indicator of what was to come. So basically what was happening is men were suffocating to death. They were turning blue because they couldn't get enough oxygen into their bodies, which is why early on, a lot of people referenced it as the plague because they were referring back to the Black Death in the 16th century because they didn't know how to deal with it. Many of you have probably seen over the last couple weeks, Philadelphia kind of be held up as the what not to do scenario. I've seen a lot of reports on nightly news in their 30-second blurbs about, the difference between Philadelphia and St. Louis during the pandemic. And it's absolutely true. Philadelphia did everything conceivably wrong. So as news is starting to leak out of Camp Devens that last week of September about the hundreds of boys that they have who are dying a day. But keep in mind, those men had already been sent out. So units had already been sent to the camp just outside of Philadelphia. Units had already been sent to Great Lakes, into Camp Grant, into Fort Dix, and to Camp Meade. They just hadn't arrived and were showing symptoms yet. In Philadelphia, at the military base, that first week, that last week of September, they were already being told that 5 soldiers had died, 7 soldiers had died. And the Philadelphia mayor and leaders of Philadelphia said, well, that's on the military base. I'm not worried about it. Then you start to see civilians who are showing up in the hospital who are starting to die. 3 here, 4 there, 5 there. Philadelphia says, I'm not worried about it. We're just fine. We're not gonna close anything down. We're not gonna quarantine anybody. We're just gonna continue on with our daily lives. There was a war bond drive. It was the final drive. It was a huge push. They were very, very close to reaching their numbers. They knew that if they held their parade, that it would push them over the top and they would break their record, their funding record, for how much money they raised for the U.S. war bond drive. Even though doctors across the city had told the mayor, do not hold this parade, they went ahead and held it anyway. And on September 26th, September 28th, over 200,000 people took to the streets of Philadelphia. It was the largest parade in Philadelphia history. People came out to see the celebrities like Mary Pickford, who were there to encourage people to buy war bonds so they could make their final push. Within 72 hours, you had thousands of people showing up at local hospitals. One after another, hospitals were reaching capacity. And Philadelphia was then scrambling to come up with a solution for what they were going to do with the sheer number of people who were pouring in sick. So Philadelphia opened up 3 auxiliary hospitals to try to attend to those who were ill, but it wasn't enough. Within 1 month, 5 weeks actually, within 5 weeks from September 28th until the end of October, over 12,000 people would be dead in the city of Philadelphia. There were so many people perishing that they didn't have enough people to deal with the bodies. There were bodies just being put out on front porches. There are stories of people still laying in bed, with their deceased loved one because nobody would come to claim the body. And what was going on in Philadelphia was, at the time, the corruption in Philadelphia was, it made Tammany Hall look like a joke. So Mayor Smith had actually been indicted that last week of September. So there was nobody at the helm of the city because the mayor was in jail. The machine politician, Vare, who was the Republican leader who kind of ran the machine in Philadelphia, was doing everything that he could to provide to the poor and provide to those who were in need. So between the machine and, I hate to say it, the mob, and the Ladies' Aid Societies, those were the 3 organizations that came together to make sure that families were being fed, that people were being cared for, that bodies were being taken to the cemeteries and were being buried. The Ladies' Aid Societies had even put out a call at one point that said, we will offer $10 to anybody who will pick up a shovel and bury the dead. They had no takers because nobody at the helm in Philadelphia was telling them what to do. There wasn't any honest, truthful information about how this disease spreads, about how they should avoid being in large crowds. There was no information provided to any of them. And what happened in Philadelphia, and it also happened in Baltimore and in other cities, is when Baltimore opened up those auxiliary hospitals, they all opened up those auxiliary hospitals in white neighborhoods. They did not open up those hospitals in African-American neighborhoods, in heavily immigrant neighborhoods. So those people were left to their own devices. So when the number of dead reported in Philadelphia says 12,000, that's not including the African-Americans, the immigrants, the Hispanic neighborhoods who were going underreported because they never sent doctors or opened hospitals in those neighborhoods to take care of those citizens. Alfred Crosby, who was also a doctor and epidemiologist, published a book shortly after the pandemic, and he talks about the city morgue in Philadelphia. And as you can see here, he talks about, you know, how they're piled 3 and 4 deep, how there was no refrigeration, and how the bodies were starting to rot. He tells one story in his book about a little boy who was curious because the morgue had the doors propped open to try to deal with the stench, and the little boy wandered in to see these bodies just laying there stacked in piles, not embalmed, you know, barely covered because they didn't have enough sheets or winding cloths in order to deal with it. This photo that you see here, they did reuse recently in a broadcast. I don't remember which channel it was on, but they were talking about the mass graves that were dug in order to bury the dead. So what Philadelphia did was it built a series of mass graves to bury the bodies, tagging each individual body with the hopes that once the pandemic was over, that family members would come back to claim the dead and then rebury them in their family plots or in family cemeteries. That didn't happen. What wound up happening was the men who were in the cemetery, the Charles Borromeo Seminary, went out into the streets and collected the bodies and started to bury the dead themselves because there wasn't anybody else to do it. So Philadelphia is definitely the worst case scenario. Cities like Boston, Chicago did not, fared better, but not well during the pandemic. And I'll come back to Chicago in just a little bit. So Camp Grant here in Rockford, again, was one of those 2 hospitals along with Camp Devens that William Welch had visited in the spring and early summer and had said, this is the model of what a hospital should be like for the U.S. Army. He was very proud of the staff. He had known the head doctor for a number of years, so he knew he was a perfectly competent man. August 8th, Camp Grant gets a new commander. So Charles Hagedorn arrives August 8th. With winter approaching, he feels that the men who are living in the tents on the parade ground need to be put into the barracks before winter because he doesn't want any man still living in a tent once winter sets in. So against all of the doctors and against all of his staff's warnings, he forces them to move these men out of the tents into the overcrowded barracks. September 15th, you get the first batch of officers who are arriving from Camp Devens. So again, remember, this is before that explosion happens at Camp Devens. By September 21st, it all starts to begin. Those soldiers arrive from Camp Devens, and within the week, you have 800 cases who show up at the hospital on September 21st. The numbers continue to climb and continue to rise. By October 8th, you have 500 soldiers who are sick and over 2,500 who are ill at Camp Grant. Commander Hagedorn, who was a lifetime career military officer, takes his own life on October 8th, the same day that the 500th soldier dies from the flu. But it doesn't quell the disease. It doesn't stop the deaths. So Commander Hagedorn's death by suicide, while it's a tragic case, and there's a story that is written up by his second in command who says that he had called him into his office and had asked him to take all of the staff out of the office and stand at attention on the parade ground. I'll be out in a few minutes. So everybody left the building. Everybody stood out on the parade ground waiting for the commander to come out. After about 20 minutes, he hadn't appeared. So his second in command had taken a step forward to go back into the building to find out what was taking so long when he heard the report of the gunshot. And that's when he found Commander Hagedorn's body. Unfortunately, the guilt that he felt from forcing those men to be put in the barracks who were then overcrowded, which then cost them their lives, was too much for him. That was the halfway point for Camp Grant. Camp Grant's numbers continued to rise and continued to climb all the way through October until about the 26th or 27th of October. Of the men, just like the other camps, 45,000 men were stationed at Camp Grant. By the end of October, you had over 12,000 soldiers and staff who had then become sick as well. The official death toll is 1,068. We know that number to be much higher, but the official registered death toll with the U.S. Army is 1,068. I'll explain what I mean by that towards the end. So while Camp Grant felt helpless and powerless to deal with what was going on within the camp, Great Lakes was kind of the opposite. Great Lakes tried to do everything it could up front to try to quell the spread of the disease as quickly as they could. And I'll talk about them in just a second. Camp Grant, just like every place else, had put out a call asking for as many funeral directors and morticians and coroners that they could from Northwestern Illinois that could become available to just help them deal with the numbers of dead. So they refer to articles as the Great Morgue because they needed somebody to help them get these boys prepared to be shipped back home to their families all across the United States. Now, I have tremendous respect for Governor Loudon. I know, unlike many in 2020, I have tremendous respect for what Governor Pritzker is facing as well, because I know what Governor Loudon went through in 1918 and 1990. So Governor Loudon acted as soon as he had gotten the news. So as soon as they start to hear about what's going on the Eastern Seaboard, what's going on at Camp Grant and in Philadelphia and in Baltimore, he requires cities and counties to start reporting flu totals on September 25th. He is actually one of the earliest to make this a mandated requirement so that we're keeping track of the number of flu deaths that are occurring within the state of Illinois. He acts very, very quickly. On September 26th, the very next day, says we're closing all political assemblages, we're closing government buildings, we're closing schools, we're closing churches. So he puts this mandate out right away, trying to stave off what he knows is coming. Some cities obeyed, some cities didn't. The city of Chicago, absolutely 100% didn't obey. And I'll talk about John Dill Robertson in just a second. But a lot of cities mostly obeyed, like in Plainfield, where I work, they did shut down schools and they did shut down the government, but they didn't shut down religious services. So they still continued to hold worship. A lot of cities shut down completely. So the state of Illinois actually fared fairly better than some other states because of Governor Loudon's actions, because he stepped forward so quickly. So luckily for us, we keep detailed health reports. So in the state of Illinois, they put out an annual health report, and the second one in Illinois coincided with the flu pandemic. So it came out in 1919, referencing what happened in 1918. And what kind of cracks me up about this, and I know it's terrible to say, but as they're reporting on the number of flu cases within the state of Illinois, they single out one single soldier. And that's what made me smile when I read this report. So they talk about a soldier who's coming back and is coming back to visit his family. And you can read it at the bottom. He's coming back to Elko in Alexander County, tells me about the size of the village. So this guy comes home, everybody's so excited to see him, they're shaking his hand, and he's hanging out at the post office and at the grocery store talking to everybody and unknowingly spreading it to everybody in his little community. Then he goes one step further and he decides he's going to go visit his girlfriend a county over and winds up infecting half of that county as well. So when they talk about super spreaders in the 20th century, and they're talking about what's going on in 2020, this guy was the super spreader for Southern Illinois. And they report about him without his name in the annual health report. So you see government health warnings showing up in local newspapers. And when you look at it, what do you believe? And it's exactly what we're facing in 2020. What do you believe? You have the official notices that are coming out from the federal government, and then right next to ads for shysters who are telling you to eat more garlic, buy bananas, eat more onions. So who do you believe? There was no regulation of the information that was being provided. There was nothing that was keeping, those charlatans from being able to post articles in the newspaper selling their tonics and their miracle cures. So even in Chicago, all around the US, nobody knew what to believe. And these were only going into English-speaking newspapers. You're not seeing as many ads like this being run in the ethnic newspapers as well, so that information isn't filtering down to the back of the yards neighborhood, little village neighborhood, or other ethnic newspapers in and around the city of Chicago. So death touches every community in Illinois, even after Governor Loudon's warnings. From state, from Mount Carmel, from Springfield, all the way up to Rockford, that page after page after page of obituary columns are filled with people who are perishing from influenza or grip or one of the other numerous titles that they were giving to it. One of my favorite resources to use is the Chicago Sentinel, which is a Jewish magazine that reported on Jews all across the United States, even though it was based in Chicago. And here's an obit running in the Jewish Sentinel in Chicago talking about a young man who passes away in Lima, Ohio. So death's reach was really very far reaching. It spread into society, it spread into music, and it spread into all kinds of other things. The pandemic really kind of took over everybody's world. So if you've ever heard the song Influenza Blues, it was actually written by a soldier who was in the 370th, which was an all-black regiment out of Chicago. There were only 2 all-black regiments in U.S. troops during the First World War, the 269th out of Harlem and the 370th out of Chicago. A lot of them were jazz musicians, and they wrote a piece called the Influenza Blues, which you can find online. Here in Plainfield, like I said, we mostly obeyed. You know, we shut down schools, you know, we closed government offices, but they refused to eliminate worship services. So some were still worshiping outside if the weather was well, but they were still getting together. So 42 people in Plainfield Cemetery died in 1918. Only 12 of them died of influenza. And you might think, oh, 12, it's not that big. But when you look at the numbers, that was 30% of the deaths in Plainfield in that single year. So you could see how that 2.5% is really seeping in to the entire US. One thing I want to point out, if you look at this article at the bottom, it says Dr. Owens is reportedly on the sick list. He has been out so much late attending to his practice that he has suffered a nervous breakdown. That happened actually more and more than has ever been reported. So you read things like JAMA, the Journal of American Medicine, you read things like New England Journal of Medicine, and page after page after page in the back of these medical journals are obituaries for doctors who have perished. So some of them, a lot of them, are dying because they're becoming exposed to the flu and they're dying of the complications, but an increasing number of them are dying by suicide. So it was a very serious, a very real problem in 1918 and 1919. 2/3 of doctors had already gone into the war effort. They were already either working on base hospitals or working as doctors overseas on the front lines. So we were understaffed. There weren't enough doctors. There weren't enough nurses. Those doctors who were fighting are getting sick and dying. Those doctors who are left behind are suffering breakdowns from the strain and the stress of what they're experiencing. So among the medical profession, the toll was extraordinarily high. So what about Great Lakes? Great Lakes tried really hard to try to quash this before it got out of control. So those first number of men are coming from Camp Devens. You know, they show up that first week of September between the 4th and the 7th. You have your first case of the flu being reported on September 8th. Once again, just like at Camp Devens, it's being misreported and misdiagnosed as meningitis. The commander is hearing about what's going on at Camp Grant and what's going on at Camp Meade and other camps. So he quickly cancels all liberty leave to all soldiers. He does not want this getting outside of Great Lakes. He quarantines those who are sick. Well, what do we know in 2020? Thousands of people are asymptomatic and they continue to spread the disease. So quarantining only those who are appearing to be sick is missing the thousands of soldiers who are still walking about the camp, who are carrying the disease without knowing it. Within the week, you've got 5,000 additional soldiers who are quarantined because they believe that they could be sick, because he took the time to quarantine those men who had contact with those who are appearing ill. He gives them daily salt throat sprays, thinking that that's going to help eliminate the spread of the disease. So he's really trying hard to keep the men in and keep the men safe and keep it from spreading out into the community. But eventually, that scale tips and they're completely overwhelmed. So by September 26th, you have 8,000 men who are sick with influenza at Great Lakes Hospital. You have 257 cases the previous day alone. You have hundreds of men who are pouring into sick bay every single day. They are dying at such an alarming rate that Great Lakes Naval Base buys up all of the winding sheets in Chicago. So as you can see in this picture, a winding sheet is a way to, secure the dead when you don't have access to caskets, when you can't get your hands on wooden coffins. The morgue, within 6 days, is stacked to capacity. There are ambulances leaving around the clock. As they're bringing bodies in who are sick, they're taking out bodies who have passed away, and they're stacking them up in the morgue. Josie Mabel Brown lived to be 100 years old, and they interviewed her in 1986 in U.S. Navy magazine, talking about her experiences during the pandemic. Now, Josie Mabel Brown wound up coming down and catching the pandemic as well. And she talks about how she was so sick that she would shake so hard from the fever that she would knock the clipboard off the end of her bed because her fever shakes were so bad. But she talks about these young boys who are dying and about how they're 3 deep, about how there's one on the bed, there's one on the floor, and there's one on a stretcher. So as the one dies, they're, playing musical chairs, with these boys, trying to put them any place that they can. That they're bringing in boys and putting them in winding sheets before they even die because they're expecting them to pass away and not get better. She talks about the morgue being stacked to the ceiling and how she always felt bad for the boy who was kind of squashed on the bottom. There are other reports of caskets going from one end of the railway station at Great Lakes to the other, stacked top to bottom underneath the veranda of caskets waiting to be loaded to be sent home to families all across the U.S. U.S. Navy Surgeon General's office in their annual report talks about the nurses at Great Lakes Naval Hospital, and they list the nurses who had perished. So if you have family who served in the medical profession, there are a lot of ways for you to find that research to be able to document their experiences through some of these journals and annual reports. Now let's talk about Chicago. Deb knows how I feel about John Dill Robertson. If I could drive to the north side of Chicago and dig him up and slap him and then bury him again, I probably would. There always has to be a villain when there's an outbreak. And in my mind, our villain is John Dill Robertson. So John Dill Robertson became the Chicago Public Health Commissioner. It was a patronage job. He had taken up the position the month before in August. While he was a doctor, he was completely ill-equipped to deal with the job or with the pandemic. So as Great Lakes is reporting what their numbers are, because they started in early September, John Dill Robertson says, I'm making a note of it. I'm keeping an eye on it. We're well aware of the situation that's going on at Great Lakes. Does nothing to prepare Chicago for what's to come. In the city of Chicago, he starts to see an uptick in flu cases as early as September 21st. Now, this is a couple of days before Governor Loudon says we need to make it mandatory to document these. He's keeping an eye on it. September 23rd, John Dill Robertson is reported in the Tribune as saying, we have the situation well in hand. No need to worry. Don't panic. We're fine. After the governor asks the entire state to shut down, John Dill Robertson ignores him, continues to hold worship services, continues to keep the city open, just as if nothing had happened. By September 30th, there are 260 verified cases, meaning they have been tested and they know that absolutely these people are sick. This is in that 5 days since John Dill Robertson was requested by the governor to keep those stats. By October 1st, he says, okay, we're going to quarantine those who are symptomatic. Once again, we know that there's a big difference between symptomatic and asymptomatic. So John Dill Robertson just tells those who are ill to stay in bed and doesn't do anything else, doesn't start to prepare hospitals, doesn't start to buy up supplies so that we're ready. Within the first week of October, the numbers explode. So while we knew there were people in Chicago and in Cook County who were already sick, by October 8th, there are reportedly 40,000 cases of those who are sick with the flu. And John Dill Robertson, who again has refused to close any type of assemblage, claims, don't worry, the backbone of the epidemic is broken. Chicago won't hit its peak for 2 more weeks. So the numbers just continue to skyrocket, over 200,000 cases. On October 8th, John Dill Robertson agrees to close the entertainment district of Chicago only. He closes the theater district. He doesn't close schools. He doesn't close churches. He doesn't close bowling alleys. He doesn't close saloons. He doesn't close the places where the poor aggregate. The only thing he closes is the theater district. Well, who goes to the theater? The wealthy go to the theater. And John Dale Robertson is quoted as lamenting, well, what are the poor theater girls going to do if we close the theaters? They're going to live, John. That's what they're going to do. They're going to live. So he closes the theater districts, but nothing else. Doesn't close the schools, doesn't close the churches. John Dale Robertson brags by the middle of October how proud he was, and this is a direct quote from John Dale Robertson, that nothing was done to interfere with the morale of the community. He intentionally lied to the citizens of Chicago because he didn't want anybody to panic and he didn't want things to get out of control. He needlessly caused thousands of lives because he refused to follow the governor's orders. He refused to close anything down. He, did not curtail all public activities, meaning the bowling alleys and the pool halls, until October 16th. By then it was way too late. It had spread throughout the city and it had spread throughout Cook County. You have 1,200 new cases being reported each and every day. The numbers are skyrocketing. And the people who are suffering at the greatest and highest rates are those in the poor ethnic neighborhoods of the city of Chicago, because he wasn't translating government posters telling people to take care into other languages. They weren't running it in those ethnic newspapers in those communities. There was very little information that was provided to them. So Cook County Hospital, which is a public hospital, had one of the highest mortality rates in the entire country. People who were coming into the hospital with the flu were dying at almost a 40% rate. And you might ask yourself, well, how can our numbers be so much higher? Because these are the people who are coming from those poor ethnic communities who couldn't afford to miss work, who were too afraid to go to the doctor until they were so ill that there was virtually no chance that they were going to survive. And the books for this are at IRAD at Northeastern Illinois University. They have them. You can hold the books in your hand and look at them for yourself, page after page after page of influenza victim. It tells you their names on the first page, who they are, when they came in, and what happened to them. So you see that there were some who did recover, but almost 40% of them passed away. There's a larger view of that same page. So now back to a whole idea of the official death tolls and about what the difference is between the official death toll and the reality. So if you look down and you follow across, you can look at Adams, there were 933 cases. If you look down to Cook County and Chicago reports 43,000 cases. Now we know for a fact that they had over 200,000 people in the city of Chicago who became sick with the flu. They officially reported 43,371. How can they get away with it? John Dale Robertson wrote a whole book that you can download on Internet Archives about all of the wonderful things he did to save the city of Chicago during the pandemic. It's a tissue of lies. Again, becoming so overwhelmed that you don't have the ability to document day by day, and the fact that they're not reporting about the number of people who are ill and who are passing away in neighborhoods like Back of the Yards, Little Village, Greektown. There was a graduate student who did a report in 2016 about the pandemic and how it affected Chicago, and she put together a heat map. So here's what you can see. You can find her thesis online if you take a look for it. But she put together this heat map which shows you the places that were most hard hit, the neighborhoods who were most hard hit. So I'm in Bridgeport, where I grew up in Bridgeport, which is like middle of the road. So if you look at it, at the time, the cities in the deep red, which are having a 20 per 1,000 death rate, if you were to extrapolate that out into like a neighborhood like Bridgeport, which had 20,000 residents in it at the time in 1920 on the 1920 census, our neighborhood alone would have lost 400 residents. So some neighborhoods were hit incredibly hard. You could see the North Shore did fairly well, but it was the ethnic neighborhoods and the African-American neighborhoods who suffered the most. So that third wave, what happened in the third wave? So from December to May of 1919, you had a third wave that kind of wrapped back around again. Cities in the US that were hit particularly hard by the third wave that had fared fairly well in the first and second were places like Phoenix, Oakland, Portland, Denver, who were struck particularly hard. Countries who hadn't been struck as hard the first time around, like Australia, were hammered in the spring of 1919. France was hit hard again. That's when President Wilson contracts the flu, leading to his stroke during the Versailles Peace process. So there were communities that had kind of fared well throughout the first two waves. Oswego, I live in Oswego. Oswego didn't get hit hard with the flu until December and January. So somehow we managed to, miss the first and second waves and really got hammered in the third wave. But in the third wave, once again, that antigen shifts back down into that normal range of 0.02%. So we've hit that spike of 2.5%, and we've slowly come back down into what they deem to be the normal rate in an average flu season. The aftermath of this, the low estimates, the global estimate is 20 million to 100 million infected. Those numbers are more likely to be 80 to 130 million people who were infected. You had, anywhere from 25 to 30% of the world pass away because of the virus. In the US, they report 25 to 30%. That number is probably closer to 37% to 40% of those who were recorded. Remember, again, because these numbers are being underreported, just because of overwhelming odds. The estimated death toll for the US is 675,000. That number is probably well over 1 million if you include all of those ethnic communities that were underreported or just not counted at all at the time of the pandemic in 1918 and 1919. So we're looking at probably a more realistic number would be 1 million deaths in the US alone during that time. By the end, when this is all said and done, like I said, 43,000 soldiers had died overseas. You had another 17,000 that died stateside, bringing our number up to just over 60,000 who wound up perishing from the flu or the pneumonia that often followed. So those doctors, like Dr. Lewis, I'll talk about him on the next slide, were the ones that spent the rest of their lives trying to get to the bottom of what this was and why it happened. But again, I talked about those official death tolls. You look at Camp Devens, and it lists the number of cases of influenza and the total death toll, 794. Camp Grant, 1,068. Fort Sherman, 1,058. We know that those numbers are probably higher, maybe not remarkably higher, but certainly higher than what was reported officially by the US Army. So I mentioned Paul Lewis. He was that very first phone call that William Welch made after he had walked out of that autopsy in Camp Devens. Other doctors who spent the rest of their lives, Alfred Crosby, Richard Shope, Johann Holton. Johann Holton in the 1950s, if you've ever read Gina Colada's book, Flu, she talks about how Johann Holton wanted to get to the bottom of the pandemic, and since there weren't any samples that had survived stateside, he had to resort to going to places where the bodies were buried beneath the permafrost, so they would be permanently frozen. So they talk about him going to remote places in Siberia and remote places in Alaska and digging up the bodies and using, I know this sounds terrible, but using garden shears, like clipping out rib, sections and bringing them back in like a cooler so that they could get the samples from these flu victims to try to get to the bottom of exactly what it was. So they finally figure out what the RNA strand is that created the virus, and it's H1N1, which we're very familiar with now. We have vaccines to treat against H1N1 now, but these doctors really spent the rest of their lives trying to get to the bottom of it. And Jeffrey K. Taubenberger is a genius. He writes a lot for the CDC. You can find a lot of his writing available. If you do a Google search on his name, you can read some of those articles that he has published about the pandemic over the last decade. He's truly probably the best researcher that we have currently alive, still researching the pandemic. So if I'm looking for resources on my family, they didn't die, but they survived. How do I find out what happened to them? Local newspapers, obituary files, day after day in the society columns are reports of people who are on the mend or people who are quarantined because they're sick. Diaries and letters, school records about teachers listing the children who are sick or those who are quarantined, American Legion records. On the state level, I showed you some of those public health department reports and the annual reports that are being posted, Red Cross records, National Guard files. In some cases, Adjutant General's offices would have how they were dealing with those who were sick within their ranks. If they died, you've got inquest files, you've got death registers and death certificates. Again, those doctors and nurses, you want to look at those nursing journals and those doctors' journals that are giving you the names of those healthcare professionals who are becoming ill or who are dying. And then on the federal level, and these are all in your handout, but in the federal level, you know, you've got War Department records, the Adjutant General's office, you've got camp newspapers, you've got burial transfer case files that they have in St. Louis, you've got those card files that I showed you at the archives in College Park, Maryland. And the World War I Museum in Kansas City has an amazing archives too that can provide and shed some light on what was going on as well. Online resources, you have these, you can go and look any of these up, just download the handout and you can access these sites. JSTOR actually has a lot of really good articles and you can use JSTOR for free. I think they allow you to view 10 articles per month with a free account. So that's definitely available to you. Library of Congress and National Archives both have dedicated collections on their site specifically to the First World War. The pandemic is included in that. And then Internet Archives as well has some tremendous resources available to you. So I will take questions. I know Deb said that people wanted to see our smiling faces, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to turn my camera on and wave and say hi.
Thanks, T.
Sit here and smile and be cheery after telling you all about death and mayhem for the last hour.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we had a couple questions during your presentation, but I wanted to get back to this. One was a comment from another Deborah. But you should do this. You should do this presentation on all major television channels in Illinois, so the public can truly understand the severity of what happened, or at least on PBS.
It would be nice, but I wouldn't pick me to do it. I would pick somebody like John Barry or actually all right, because Deb's a freak, and I know Deb's a freak, and she has the Hamilton app, I'm assuming. So if any of you have gone in and downloaded, because you have access to EduHam for free right now, that gets you an account into, I can't say the name, Gilder Lehman. Is that how you say that?
Yeah, Gilder Lerman.
Gilder Lerman. If you sign up for EduHam and it gets you into Gilder Lehman, John Barry is actually doing a pandemic book talk Sunday, May 25th. Registration is not open yet, but I'm like ready to pounce for as soon as registration opens because I would love to be able to hear him talk first person. I've listened to audio recordings of him talk on other broadcasts, but I'm like really excited to hear him talk about it.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds really good. Now there's just I'm going to answer a question from KS Schultz. Where do we find the handout? KS Schultz, we sent you a copy of the handout if you registered. So that was in your email. So when you registered for the program, we sent 2 emails out, one yesterday, one this morning at 10. So please go back and check your registration email. The handout is there.
It's on my website too. So if you go to Tamarack Genealogy under handouts, it's there.
Yeah. Thanks, T. So just one other thing that I had, somebody sent me a question through my text message. African-American nurses. So where we start to see African-American nurses joining the nursing corps is during the flu pandemic. Because for the longest time, there was a lot of prejudice against African-American nurses. But once this call comes out saying like, hey, we need people to come in and be nursing staff, and all of a sudden like no takers. And then all of a sudden this was an excellent opportunity for women who had been denied entry into the Army Nursing Corps based on race. The government's like just kind of threw up their hands and said like, okay, come on board now. You can come on in. So it did take the flu pandemic to integrate our Army Nursing Corps, which is really important because I think up to that point, only the YMCA and the YWCA accepted women of color in service situations, and a lot of organizations were segregated.
Only certain ones too, not the YMCA's
right.
in the South, like not the Red Cross in the South. Like you're talking, New York, you're talking Maryland.
So it took a global pandemic for us for the nursing corps to become integrated, which is You know, who would have thought? But there you are. So
And to think
Tim
about
did
that
have
shortage, I mean, that shortage of doctors and nurses, I mean, they were putting out calls asking for anybody. So school teachers, when the school closed, the school teachers were then becoming nurses to try to help out. What cracks me up about Philadelphia is that they put out a call to all of the rich people's private nurses, asking the rich families, can you spare your nurse? You really don't need her. Can we have her for a couple of weeks? We're dealing with something pretty big here. And you'd be surprised how many of them said no.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's not give up your private nurse generosity sort of situation going on there,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that it's my nurse and you can't have her. So
Yeah, Philadelphia is the city of love.
okay. So Tim had a question. He wanted to know earlier, and I thought we would get it, you touched on this a little bit, but he wanted to know that the flu epidemic, how the flu epidemic altered the course of the war in Europe. So did it lead to Germany to surrender earlier if they had not had an outbreak? And I know starvation had quite a bit to do with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and Germany dropping out a little bit earlier and kind of losing momentum during the spring offensive. But did you run across anything in your lecture that talked about specifically about Germany kind of coming to a halt because of the flu pandemic?
They all did. Germany, again, when I talk about official records and reality, officially they're reporting 30,000 sick, 40,000 sick. That's BS. Their numbers were probably 3 times that high. And by underreporting, they kind of made it sound like, well, we can still fight. None of them could fight. Germany couldn't fight. France couldn't fight. The UK couldn't fight. And it is true that, you know, had Germany made one more push, they could have broken the British and French lines. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But the flu ground everybody to a halt, because you're talking at least half, if not more than half, you know, of your fighting forces are too sick to even sit up.
Right.
So, I mean, it really did cause a separation and a break long enough for U.S. troops to start to arrive. Because, you know, if the flu hadn't really ground everybody to a halt in April and May of 1918, the U.S. wouldn't have been there in time.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I had a question from Gail, but it was something that she wanted to know about our upcoming events. And Gail, I'm really glad that you asked that question. Perfect segue.
Did you prompt her to do that? Gail,
I did not.
Sweet.
Gail did this entirely on her own. So thank you, Gail. So here we have, guys, just a couple of the programs that we have coming up. Tina Beaird will be back with us for social media for genealogy research on Friday the 22nd. No library card is required, but please, guys, remember to put your email address in your registration, or I don't have a good way to get a hold of you. But we do have Maureen Brady coming up next on May 13th at 11 a.m. We also have Tina Beaird coming back on May 22nd. And then I'm stepping in to do the War of 1812 because that program did win our Facebook poll on programs you guys wanted to see. It came in first over who stole, that one time Martha Washington's will got stolen.
You gotta do that one too.
Well, I've got some really great programs coming up in June.
That's a good
one. You know, I might do it in July. It might be that sort of Independence Day thing that we could kind of do in July, but it's an amazing story about how Martha Washington's will was stolen, how a group of DAR women lobbied hardcore to get a millionaire playboy to gift the will back and give it back to where it belonged. It's a great story. If you're in DAR or you know anybody who's in DAR who loves it, or if you know anybody who just really loves talking about the legality of records, you're going to love this program. It's going to be great. Anyway, but I might do it in July, but that's just a spoiler. So the next thing that you guys have, if you missed a session and you want to come back and watch our sessions, please sign up on our blog to receive genealogy blog updates, because I do try to get back and and let everybody know, like, hey, we had this webinar, here's the handout, here's the link, this is how you can get a hold of us. So you can do that through our blog, or you can go on and join our Fountaindale Public Library Genealogy Club on Facebook. We've had a lot of people become members lately, so if you become a member, thank you very much. But that's a way to see the posting super fast, super early, and it's also available to get a chance to get the handouts as quickly as our tech wizard, Mr. Jeffrey, makes those items available. I post those on Facebook right away so everybody can watch them typically later the same day. So as we get back, it looks like I do have 2 other questions, T. So thank you, Linda. She's going to add it to her calendar to join it. Yes, please. We would love to have you and your friends, Linda. And Sally says, thank you, Tina and Deborah. It's a very interesting but sad time. Stay well. We are staying well, Sally. And I know it sounds like super weird, but like, you know, it's amazing spending so much time in World War I land, Tina, that like when you and I were discussing this, even when we were getting ready for our first World War I lecture in 2017,
16, 17.
I think is what we did our first like session of lectures. We really kind of looked at it and said, you know, we were trying to like find a way for like, how do people know that what we're doing, like how does this influence today's audience? And nothing was more apparent that like, we need to address the elephant in the room than talking about the pandemic, because there have been some webinars, there have been other presentations, but honestly, you guys, some of the highest watched films on like Netflix were like something to do with global pandemics and whatever have you. And I'm like, hey, why watch something fictional when you can learn about the real life? We need to talk about the real life situation from 1918 all the way into 1920.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and you look at the comparisons now and then, and you hear a lot. I mean, if you look at the death tolls, what we've seen so far, to me, this is more what we're experiencing right now is more like the 1957 pandemic than 1918, but we don't know if there's going to be a second wave. So I can't say whether or not this is truly a comparison to 100 years ago. What I'm seeing right now is closer to 1957 or 1968, which you can look up. But really what it came down to in 1918 and 1919 was the government response. There was no federal government response. Wilson was so hung up on the war in Europe that he wasn't regulating what states were supposed to do. So it came down to states doing it themselves. Sound familiar? No offense, everybody.
Well, you know, it's life imitating art in that aspect. Yeah.
It's very similar to what we're seeing. Some governors are really clamping down. It really comes down to how well people work under pressure. So you see some states who are floundering, like, I don't know what to do. And you have some states who are really, here's what we're going to do. Here's our plan. Here's how we're going to get equipment. Here's how we're going to keep people safe. So, you know, it really, honestly, it doesn't come down to Democratic or Republican. It doesn't. It comes down to how well your leader can work under pressure is really what it amounts to. And we see that from state to state to state in 1918 and 1919, and we're seeing it now.
Yeah,
you know,
the one place where I see that
your affiliation.
Right. Well, the one thing like that you noted was that didn't happen in Chicago in the pandemic of 1918, 1919 was that how the one thing I did notice with today, Governor Pritzker did try to have materials available in Spanish and in different languages at the same time that he was addressing it in English. So automatically Chicago's reputation for how we're addressing this pandemic has gone up exponentially, I think, from the way that it was handled in 1918 to 1919.
Oh, I truly have nothing but good things to say about Dr. Arwady for Chicago Public Health and Dr. Ezike about what they're doing, because they're evolving and they're recognizing. They're seeing that it's hitting certain communities harder. And what Chicago did in 1918 was just turn a blind eye, stuck his head in the sand and was like, everything's fine, there's no problem here, like the Wizard of Oz, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. And John Dill Robertson's refusal, because he was afraid that people were going to panic, that misinformation campaign about not telling people to stay safe, stay away from each other, just, hey, if you don't feel well, go home, but not telling them how you catch it, how you spread it, how you avoid it. He didn't do any of those things. And thousands of people got sick that didn't need to get sick. Not closing schools was a huge part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so, guys, like this is the things that when you can take away from this experience and what we wanted you guys to get out of this lecture is that, this is not the first time that we've come up across this, especially in Chicago. And the more that you learn about history and the more you learn about how it impacts your family and the more you see your family story in that, the more you're able to say, you know what, we've done this before. You know, I might not have been personally there, but my ancestors are there. Maybe this is something that's knitted in our DNA, but it's definitely passed down in family stories that, you know, how things are addressed and how we record it and how we pass it on to the future helps not only ourselves process the situation, but it gives future generations the opportunity to say, like, you know what, you know, Grandma Tina talked about the pandemic. She did a lot of research on it. She did a lot of research on her family. I'm going to go back and read that. And through that, that's a way for me to kind of get through the situation that I'm going through. So if you are writing anything about the pandemic in your own lives, please do so. So that way we'll say, oh, I have a diary from the pandemic from that time period. Record it, write it, and hand it down. Because one of the things that I looked back a lot, especially in the early days in March, it sounds weird, but in the early days of March, I went back through Uncle Frank's, my Uncle Frank, who was 16 when he enlisted in the Army Air Service, and he was sick in England. He was in Southampton at the time, and they sent him to a hospital in Brighton because he had the flu, and he was there for maybe 2 weeks, and they finally looked at him and said, you know, son, you're well enough, go back to your unit. And he made it back to his unit just in time for the next day for them to get on the boat to France. So he was still recovering. He was still not 100%. And they sent him right back into service. But he talked about that in an interview that he did much later in life, and that how he was just so weak and he was kind of out of it. But he was very fortunate that he got to the hospital. There wasn't an ambulance. I mean, he had to walk to the hospital, and then he was there for a while, and then he had to walk back. I mean, that's you know,
uphill both ways.
He's 16. Yeah, it was available space, and he wasn't able to get it. So, but he talked about being just so weak and so tired, and you can imagine that he probably didn't tell a lot of people, but I can, you know, you can tell from his words that everybody else was very supportive of him once he got back to the unit. That like, oh, Frankie, we missed you. And oh, Frankie, you know, we're glad you're back and that you made it out. But there's a couple photos we have of him in the hospital with like some English guys who were in the hospital as well, they took pictures together, you know, so he made some new friends. But I kept thinking about that 6-year-old who's by himself, you know, in a unit, serving abroad, walked to and from the hospital. Like, I mean, that gives you a whole definition of, I walked to school barefoot with a kid brother on my back, both ways in the snow, you know. That if my Uncle Frank can walk to and from the hospital in 1918 and go there and back again with the flu and then rejoin his unit and then go off and perform the rest of the military service he was trained for, that's a story I definitely think is worth talking about and worth documenting. So that's something I really want to take a look at. Okay, so it doesn't look like there's any other question and answers, but we got a lot of really great comments. So thanks to Lori who brought in something. She said, thanks to both of you. Tina, you made this very interesting and scary, but Lori, you know, we're here to discuss this, and we're here to discuss not only some of the parallels, but the history. So thanks for stopping in with us. I know it seems scary, but you know, it's a serious subject, and sometimes that makes us a little scared, but the more we know, the more we become empowered.
If you're a history geek like I am, I was telling Deb before we started, a brand new book came out on March 25th, and it's called War Fever. So if any of you are interested in finding it, ordering it online through your book retailer, it's about Boston specifically during the First World War, and they talk about the pandemic, and they talk about 3 people in particular, a German doctor who was kind of ostracized because he was German during the pandemic. But then the third person they talk about is Babe Ruth. You guys know me, I'm a huge baseball junkie. My all-time favorite baseball player, Christy Mathewson, had come down with the flu overseas in France. But they actually talk about how Babe Ruth had come down with the flu twice. So I can't wait to read it, because I'd never heard in my research that Babe Ruth had gotten sick twice. But this is a brand new book. It just came out. So if you read it, we can talk about it.
Absolutely. And so Gail asked us how we can locate your event that's coming up. Gail, I'm going to send that to you right now I'm going to type out the questions so you can go through and do that. So you can just register, guys, through our main Fountaindale webpage for any of the genealogy events that we come up. There's a library card listing on there, but you're not required to give a library card. Just go under that Communico link that I just sent you, Gail, or in the link that we have on our Fountaindale blog and on our Facebook page. Just type in genealogy. If you don't know where it is, just type in genealogy in the little search box, and all of our genealogy events will show up. So that's typically it. All right, Gail meant through TV event through edu.ham. Oh, I'm sorry. So you had the question. So
Yeah.
Gilder Lerman should have that on their website, shouldn't they?
Yeah, it should be. They're called book chats. Like there's one this Sunday that Eric Fonner, so if you're a Revolutionary War buff like I am, Eric Fonner is going to be talking about his book, The Second Founding, which is about the, reassertion of the Constitution after the Civil War. And then every week there's a different speaker. So if you go down a couple of weeks to May 25th is when it's supposed to be John Barry. But registration isn't open yet, so I don't know if they'll do that after the Sunday for the previous speaker, when they'll open that up. But I know that I'm definitely keeping an eye on it.
Yep. So I just sent that to Gail. So you guys, and I know Tina will, if you'll be so kind at some point to send us the link to that. So I'll put that in our Genealogy Club Facebook page, and I'll make sure to put it in our blog posting. Because we do have a couple of things that I'm going to make a whole blog post, not only about this event that we've had today, because I know we're running over, so I apologize, but we're going to feature not only this pandemic lecture, but I'm shooting a video from home about World War I cooking. So I'm doing that, finally getting around to doing that one egg sponge cake. Yeah, the one egg sponge cake. I'm going to make it. So you guys are going to see that. I'm going to have some links and resources to World War I ration cookbooks from that time period. Then I'm going to add some extra videos from Extra Credit, which they have an amazing series on the pandemic as well, which goes into in-depth a lot of the things that Tina talked about, but with fun graphics and illustrations, which will be great. So apart from that, guys, the last one, Tim does say that, speaking of Babe Ruth, in the 1918 World Series, he played a month earlier than the usual due to World War I. And the games were played from September 5th to the 11th, right when Camp Devens was in the start of their flu outbreak. Do you know if Babe Ruth got sick immediately after the World Series?
That's what I need to find out, because they said twice, so I'm really curious to investigate that. But another fun World War I fact is the fact that the national anthem was played for the very first time when the Cubs were playing in the World Series, and it was being played at Comiskey. So got to get my South Side fix in there. But it was so well received that they began doing it during every game. So President Wilson was here, the Army band played, and that all started in Chicago.
That's crazy. So there's a lot of things coming to the epicenter, you guys. But yeah, so we're going to sign off because there's 37 of you guys who hung on to the very end. So
you guys are
thanks
awesome.
so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, we had a great time. So thank you guys so much for coming in. We'll see you at future Genealogy Club meetings. And thanks, T. I really appreciate you stopping in.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for being awesome and making everything
thank you, Jeffrey.
All right, I'll see you.